When squadron leader David Campbell reviewed the combat reports flooding into Fighter Command headquarters in late 1943, he noticed something that defied every assumption Whitehall had made about aerial warfare. A small group of pilots, men the War Office had initially relegated to ground duties, men whose very presence in Spitfire cockpits had sparked heated debates in the corridors of power, were achieving kill ratios that surpassed even the most decorated British aces. These were the black pilots of the RAF, men from the Caribbean, Africa and beyond, who had crossed oceans to defend a nation that wasn't quite sure what to do with them. But here was the shocking truth that would force the British High Command to make a decision that would reverberate through history. These pilots weren't just good, they were systematically dismantling Luftwaffe squadrons with a precision and ferocity that German intelligence couldn't explain. What happened next would challenge the very foundations of the British military establishment and prove that the greatest weapon in Britain's arsenal wasn't technology. It was the courage to recognize excellence wherever it emerged, even when it shattered every preconception about who could be a hero. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Air Ministry building in Whitehall, as Air Vice Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's successor, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, reviewed a stack of personnel files that had been gathering dust since 1940. It was November 1942, and Britain's situation remained precarious. The Luftwaffe, though bloodied by the Battle of Britain, had reorganized and was launching increasingly sophisticated raids against British cities and strategic targets. RAF Fighter Command was stretched desperately thin, losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The files before Leigh-Mallory represented a resource that had been systematically ignored. Volunteers from across the British Empire and Commonwealth who had travelled thousands of miles to join the fight. Among them were dozens of black pilots from the Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, as well as from British colonies in Africa, and even a handful from the United States who had crossed the border into Canada to enlist before America entered the war. These men had paid their own passage across U-boat-infested waters, had trained at their own expense in some cases, and had arrived in Britain with one burning desire: to fly and fight for the Allied cause. But the British military establishment, steeped in centuries of imperial tradition and rigid class structures, had not known what to do with them. The official policy was deliberately vague. There was no explicit ban on black pilots, but there was an unspoken understanding that certain roles were simply not appropriate. Most of these volunteers had been shunted into ground crew positions, relegated to loading ammunition, maintaining aircraft, or performing administrative duties. Their flying skills, often considerable, were left to atrophy, while white pilots with less experience were rushed through training and into combat squadrons. The problem was becoming acute. By late 1942, Fighter Command was losing approximately 150 pilots per month to combat accidents and exhaustion. The training pipeline, even running at maximum capacity, could barely keep pace. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was introducing new tactics and aircraft. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 had proven a nasty surprise, outperforming the Spitfire Mkv in several key areas. Britain needed every capable pilot it could muster, yet dozens of trained, eager men were being wasted in roles that didn't utilize their skills. The catalyst came from an unexpected source. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, one of the RAF's highest-scoring aces, had been conducting informal assessments at several training facilities. At RAF Cranwell, he encountered Flight Sergeant Ulrich Cross, a Trinidadian who had been working as a navigation instructor despite holding a pilot's license and having logged over 300 hours of flight time before even arriving in Britain. Johnson, a pragmatist who cared only about combat effectiveness, took Cross up in a two-seater Hurricane for an evaluation flight. What Johnson witnessed stunned him. Cross flew with a precision and situational awareness that exceeded many of the green pilots Johnson had been leading into combat. His gunnery was exceptional, his aerobatic skills were polished, and most importantly, he possessed that indefinable quality that separated adequate pilots from natural fighters, an aggressive instinct tempered by tactical intelligence. Johnson immediately filed a report recommending Cross for immediate transfer to an operational squadron. The report landed on Lee Mallory's desk alongside similar recommendations from other squadron leaders who had begun to question why capable pilots were being kept from combat roles. But it also landed in an environment of intense bureaucratic resistance. Several senior officers at the Air Ministry argued that integrating black pilots into operational squadrons would damage morale and create unnecessary complications. There were concerns about how white pilots would react, how the public would respond, and though rarely stated explicitly, whether these men could truly perform under the extreme pressures of aerial combat. Lee Mallory faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of British military culture. The RAF prided itself on being more meritocratic than the Army, less bound by the rigid class distinctions that had characterized British military leadership for centuries. The service had promoted men from working-class backgrounds to positions of command based on ability, not birth. Yet here was a test of whether that meritocracy extended across racial lines. The decision was made easier by desperation. In December 1942, Lee Mallory authorized a limited trial program. A small number of black pilots, initially just 12, would be assigned to operational squadrons on a probationary basis. They would fly combat missions, and their performance would be rigorously evaluated. If they proved themselves, the program would expand. If they failed, it would quietly be discontinued, and the men would return to ground duties. The selection process was deliberately rigorous, designed to ensure that only the most capable pilots were chosen, though cynics noted that the standards applied were considerably higher than those for white pilots entering the same squadrons. Among those selected were Ulrich Cross, who would join No. 139 Squadron Flying Mosquitoes, Flight Sergeant Billy Strachan from Jamaica, assigned to No. 242 Squadron with Spitfires, and Pilot Officer Cy Grant from British Guiana, who would fly Lancasters with Bomber Command. But the most significant assignment was Flight Lieutenant Johnny Smythe from Sierra Leone, who was posted to No. 608 Squadron, a fighter unit operating Spitfire Mk9s out of RAF Biggin Hill. Smythe had an unusual background. He had been educated at Oxford before the war and spoke with the refined accent of the British upper class, which made some officers more comfortable with him, though he was acutely aware of the condescension implicit in their approval. He was also an exceptional pilot, with a natural gift for deflection shooting and an almost preternatural ability to anticipate enemy movements. The pilots arrived at their new squadrons in January 1943 to a mixed reception. Some squadron mates welcomed them with the typical British reserve, but genuine curiosity. Others were openly skeptical, making their doubts clear through cold shoulders and pointed comments in the mess. A few were actively hostile. Though the RAF's strict discipline kept overt racism in check, the black pilots understood they were on trial, not just as individuals, but as representatives of everyone who looked like them. Failure would close doors for years, perhaps decades. Success might open them, but only if it was undeniable. The pressure was immense. They were flying some of the most dangerous missions of the war, facing an experienced and deadly enemy, while simultaneously having to prove themselves to their own comrades. Every mistake would be magnified, every success scrutinized for luck rather than skill. They flew with the knowledge that they carried not just their own lives in their hands, but the aspirations of thousands of black servicemen across the empire who were watching to see if the door to full participation in the war effort would open or slam shut. In those first weeks of 1943, as they climbed into their cockpits and took to the grey British skies, these pilots were about to demonstrate something that would shock the British High Command and confound German intelligence. that excellence in combat had nothing to do with the color of a pilot's skin, and everything to do with skill, courage, and an unshakable determination to prove that they belonged in the fight for freedom. The stage was set for a transformation that would challenge the British military establishment to live up to its own stated ideals of meritocracy and fair play, values that would be tested in the crucible of aerial combat over the English Channel and occupied Europe. The operational reality of RAF fighter squadrons in early 1943 was brutal and unforgiving. No. 608 Squadron, based at RAF Biggin Hill in Kent, flew daily sweeps over occupied France, escorted bomber formations deep into German territory, and intercepted Luftwaffe raids targeting British ports and industrial centres. The life expectancy of a new pilot was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The Luftwaffe pilots they faced were veterans of years of combat, men who had fought over Poland, France, Britain, Russia, and North Africa. They were skilled, aggressive, and flying aircraft that were, in some cases, superior to what the RAF could field. Into this environment stepped Flight Lieutenant Johnny Smythe and the other black pilots, carrying not just the standard burden of combat stress, but the additional weight of institutional skepticism. The squadron commander, squadron leader James "Jimmy" Rankin, was a pragmatic Scotsman who had survived 3 years of combat through a combination of skill and caution. He made his position clear in the first briefing. "I don't care if you're black, white, or bloody purple. If you can fly and fight, you're welcome. If you can't, you'll get yourself and others killed, and I'll have you transferred. Prove yourselves in the air. That's the only place that matters." It was a fair statement, but it also meant that Smythe and the others would have to demonstrate their worth in the most dangerous proving ground imaginable. There would be no grace period, no allowance for the learning curve that white pilots typically received. They would be judged from their first mission. That first mission came on January 15th, 1943. The squadron was tasked with escorting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses returning from a raid on industrial targets in northern France. Intelligence reported that Luftwaffe fighter units, including elements of the elite Jagdgeschwader 26, were likely to intercept. Smythe was assigned to Blue Section, flying as wingman to Flight Lieutenant Peter Dawson, a veteran with 7 confirmed kills. The weather was typically British: low clouds, intermittent rain, visibility poor. The formation crossed the Channel at 18,000 feet, the Spitfires weaving above and around the lumbering bombers. Smythe's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced. He had flown hundreds of hours, but never in combat. The theoretical knowledge from training, deflection angles, energy management, tactical formations, would now be tested against men trying to kill him. The attack came without warning. A swarm of 4 FW-190s dove out of the cloud layer above, targeting the rear of the bomber formation. The German pilots were executing a classic bounce: high speed, surprise, a quick firing pass, then climbing back into the clouds before the escorts could react. It was a tactic that had claimed dozens of Allied bombers and their crews, but Smythe had seen them. In the split second before the German fighters opened fire, he had caught the glint of sunlight on a canopy, a shadow moving against the grey clouds. His reaction was instinctive and immediate. "Blue 2, breaking right, bandits 6 o'clock high." He threw his Spitfire into a hard, climbing turn, not away from the threat, but toward it, a maneuver that violated the standard defensive doctrine, but put him in a position to intercept the lead German fighter. The FW-190 pilot, focused on his bombing target, didn't see Smythe until it was too late. Smythe's deflection shot was perfect, a 2-second burst from his 20mm cannons and 303 machine guns that raked across the German fighter's wing root and engine cowling. Smoke erupted from the Focke-Wulf, and it rolled inverted, trailing fire as it fell away. Smythe didn't watch it fall. He was already tracking the second fighter, which had broken off its attack and was trying to dive away. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, One German fighter was confirmed destroyed, another damaged and fleeing, and the bomber formation was intact. Smythe's Spitfire had taken a single bullet hole in the tail, evidence that he had been in the thick of the fight. When the squadron landed back at Biggin Hill, the debriefing was electric with adrenaline and grudging respect. Squadron leader Rankin's assessment was terse but significant. "Good work, Smythe. Textbook interception. That bomber crew owes you their lives." It was the first crack in the wall of skepticism, but not everyone was convinced. In the officers' mess that evening, Smythe overheard a conversation between two pilots who hadn't been on the mission. "Lucky shot, probably. Let's see if he can do it again when Jerry's really coming for him." The comment stung, but Smythe understood the dynamic. One success proved nothing. He would have to do it again and again until the pattern became undeniable. Over the following weeks, the pattern did become undeniable. Smythe flew mission after mission, and his combat record began to accumulate. By the end of February, he had 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. But more importantly, he had demonstrated qualities that marked him as an exceptional fighter pilot. His gunnery was consistently accurate, a critical skill when ammunition was limited and firing opportunities were brief. His situational awareness was remarkable. He seemed to have an instinct for where enemy fighters would appear. And he was aggressive without being reckless, pressing attacks when he had an advantage, but breaking off when the odds turned against him. The other black pilots in the trial program were showing similar results. Billy Strachan, flying Spitfires with No. 242 Squadron, had become known for his ability to nurse damaged aircraft back to base, a skill that saved not just his own life, but provided valuable intelligence about German weapons and tactics. Ulrich Cross, flying Mosquito night fighters, was racking up kills against German bombers, targeting British cities. His navigation skills and cool temperament making him ideally suited to the demands of night combat. But success brought its own complications. As the black pilots' combat records grew, they began to attract attention that made some in the RAF hierarchy uncomfortable. Newspaper correspondents, always hungry for human interest stories, started asking questions about the colonial pilots who were distinguishing themselves in combat. The Air Ministry's Public Relations Department faced a dilemma. Publicizing these pilots' successes could boost morale and demonstrate the Empire's unity, but it could also raise uncomfortable questions about why such capable men had been kept from combat roles for so long. The decision was made to keep the pilots' stories quiet, at least for the time being. Official combat reports would record their successes, but press releases would avoid highlighting their racial background. It was a typically British compromise, acknowledging reality while avoiding controversy. Meanwhile, the operational demands on Fighter Command continued to intensify. In March 1943, the RAF launched Operation Spartan, a series of large-scale fighter sweeps designed to draw the Luftwaffe into combat and attrit German fighter strength before the planned invasion of Europe. These missions were among the most dangerous of the war, flying deep into occupied territory, deliberately provoking combat with an enemy fighting over their own bases, with short fuel reserves and no margin for error. Smythe and No. 608 Squadron flew multiple Spartan missions. On March 18th, during a sweep over the Pas-de-Calais, the squadron encountered a formation of Bf 109Gs from Jagdgeschwader 2, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced units. The resulting dogfight was chaotic and brutal. Smythe found himself in a turning fight with a German pilot who was clearly a veteran. Every move Smythe made was countered, every advantage neutralized. The two aircraft spiraled down from 20,000 feet to less than 5,000, each pilot trying to gain the killing position. It was Smythe's patience that won the engagement. Rather than forcing the issue, he maintained his defensive position, conserving energy, waiting for his opponent to make a mistake. When the German pilot, frustrated and perhaps low on fuel, tried to break off the engagement with a climbing turn, Smythe was ready. He pulled his Spitfire's nose up, led the target perfectly, and fired. The burst caught the Messerschmitt in the cockpit area. The German fighter rolled slowly onto its back and dove into the French countryside. When Smythe landed back at Biggin Hill, his aircraft was nearly out of fuel and he was physically and mentally exhausted. But he had survived one of the most demanding types of aerial combat, a prolonged one-on-one engagement with a skilled opponent, and emerged victorious. Squadron leader Rankin recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross, a decoration that recognized exceptional valor and skill in aerial combat. The recommendation made its way up the chain of command, where it created an unexpected problem. Awarding a DFC to a black pilot would make him one of the most decorated black servicemen in the British military. It would be impossible to keep his story quiet. The Air Ministry would have to decide whether to embrace the narrative of meritocracy and imperial unity or continue the policy of quiet acknowledgement without public recognition. While bureaucrats debated, Smythe and the other black pilots continued to fly and fight. By April 1943, the trial program had exceeded every expectation. The 12 pilots had collectively achieved over 30 confirmed kills, with minimal losses. Only one pilot had been shot down, and he had successfully evaded capture and returned to Britain via the escape lines through France and Spain. Their loss rate was actually lower than the squadron average, suggesting that their skills and caution were keeping them alive in an environment where survival was never guaranteed. But the most significant impact was on their squadron mates. The initial skepticism had given way to respect, and in some cases, genuine admiration. Pilots who had been coldly distant in January were now seeking out Smythe and the others for advice on tactics and gunnery. The mess hall conversations had shifted from questioning their presence to celebrating their victories. The transformation wasn't universal. Some officers remained uncomfortable with the integration, but the culture was changing, driven by the undeniable evidence of combat effectiveness. Yet even as the pilots proved themselves in the air, they faced daily reminders of their outsider status on the ground. In nearby towns, some pubs refused to serve them. They received hate mail from civilians who objected to their presence in Britain. And within the RAF itself, there were limits to how far they could rise. Command positions remained effectively closed, regardless of their combat records. The contradiction was stark. Britain would allow them to die for the country, but not to lead. They could be heroes in the air, but not equals on the ground. It was a hypocrisy that the pilots understood intellectually, but struggled with emotionally. They had come to fight fascism, to defend freedom and democracy, yet they were confronting prejudice within the very institution they served. As spring turned to summer in 1943, the black pilots of the RAF had proven beyond any doubt that they could fly and fight as well as anyone. But the question remained: would the British High Command fully embrace them, or would they remain a tolerated exception, their achievements acknowledged, but their full potential constrained by the same prejudices they had crossed oceans to escape? The answer would come in a way that no one expected, driven by events that would force the British military establishment to confront its own contradictions. In a nondescript office building in Berlin, Major Klaus Reinhardt of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was experiencing a growing sense of professional frustration. Reinhardt was responsible for analyzing RAF fighter tactics and pilot quality, information critical to Luftwaffe operational planning. His reports, based on interrogations of captured Allied pilots, analysis of combat film from German fighters, and signals intelligence, had always been reliable. But in the spring and summer of 1943, he was encountering anomalies that didn't fit his carefully constructed models of RAF capabilities. The data was confusing. Luftwaffe pilots returning from missions over the Channel and France were reporting encounters with RAF fighters that displayed unusual tactical sophistication. These weren't the aggressive but sometimes predictable attacks that characterized most RAF fighter sweeps. Instead, German pilots described opponents who fought with exceptional patience and precision. pilots who seemed to anticipate German tactics, who exploited mistakes with ruthless efficiency, and who demonstrated gunnery skills that exceeded the RAF average. What made this particularly puzzling was that these encounters were being reported by some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, men who had survived years of combat and knew how to assess an opponent's skill level. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler of JG-27, a pilot with over 40 kills to his credit, had filed a combat report that caught Reinhardt's attention. Engaged Spitfire over Abbeville. Pilot demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and deflection shooting. Broke off engagement after sustaining damage. This was not a typical RAF pilot. Tactical sophistication suggested extensive combat experience, possibly a squadron leader or flight commander. But when Reinhardt cross-referenced the engagement details with RAF unit identifications, the Spitfire in question had been from number 608 Squadron, and the pilot was listed as a flight lieutenant, not a senior commander. Similar reports were accumulating from across the Channel front. German pilots were encountering RAF fighters that fought with a level of skill that seemed inconsistent with the known experience levels of RAF squadrons, which were constantly being diluted by the influx of replacement pilots. Reinhardt's initial hypothesis was that the RAF had created an elite unit, perhaps drawing the best pilots from multiple squadrons into a specialized formation. This would be consistent with German practice. The Luftwaffe had its own elite units like JG-26 and JG-2 that concentrated experienced pilots. But signals intelligence didn't support this theory. The unusual encounters were being reported across multiple RAF squadrons, not concentrated in a single unit. A second theory emerged from interrogations of recently captured RAF pilots. Several prisoners, when asked about changes in RAF tactics, had made oblique references to new pilots who were showing everyone how it's done. The comments were vague, but they suggested that something had changed in RAF training or recruitment. Reinhardt requested more detailed interrogations, specifically asking about any new training programs or tactical doctrines. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In June 1943, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft managed to photograph RAF Biggin Hill during a period of clear weather. The images, analyzed by photo interpreters, showed the usual array of Spitfires and ground equipment. But one analyst, examining the photographs of pilots walking between aircraft and buildings, noted something unusual. Several of the figures appeared to be black. The observation was initially dismissed as a photographic artifact or perhaps ground crew, but when similar observations were made in photographs of other RAF bases, Reinhardt began to investigate. The possibility that the RAF was using black pilots in combat roles had never seriously been considered by German intelligence. The Nazi racial ideology, which permeated every aspect of German military thinking, held that non-white peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of mastering complex technical skills like flying high-performance fighters. The idea that black pilots could not only fly but excel in combat was literally incomprehensible within the framework of Nazi racial theory. Reinhardt, a professional intelligence officer who had learned to separate ideology from analysis, began to construct a different picture. He reviewed the timeline of unusual combat encounters and found that they had begun in January 1943. He cross-referenced this with any available intelligence about changes in RAF policy and found fragmentary references in intercepted communications to colonial pilots and Empire volunteers being assigned to operational squadrons. The pieces began to fit together. His report to his superiors was carefully worded. He presented the evidence, the unusual combat encounters, the timeline, the photographic intelligence, the prisoner interrogations. He concluded that the RAF appeared to have begun integrating pilots from colonial territories into frontline squadrons, and that these pilots were demonstrating above-average combat effectiveness. He recommended that Luftwaffe tactical doctrine be updated to account for the possibility of encountering highly skilled opponents in any engagement, not just when facing known elite RAF units. The response from his superiors was dismissive and in some cases hostile. General Major Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, rejected the report's conclusions. "The English are desperate," he wrote in his response. "They are scraping the bottom of the barrel using colonial troops because they have exhausted their own manpower. These pilots may have some basic competence, but they cannot match German pilots in combat. The reports of unusual skill are likely exaggerations or misidentifications of actual elite RAF pilots." Other senior Luftwaffe officers were even more explicit in their rejection of Reinhardt's analysis. The idea that black pilots could outfight German aviators was not just strategically inconvenient, it was ideologically unacceptable. To acknowledge that non-white pilots were achieving superior combat results would undermine the entire racial hierarchy that justified Nazi policy. It was easier to dismiss the evidence than to confront the implications, but the evidence continued to accumulate. In July 1943, Hauptmann Josef "Pips" Priller, the commander of JG-26 and one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter leaders, had a personal encounter that he couldn't dismiss. Leading a swarm of FW-190s in an attack on a formation of B-17s, Priller found himself engaged by a Spitfire that fought with a skill level he had rarely encountered. The British pilot anticipated every move, maintained perfect energy management, and nearly shot Priller down before the German ace managed to escape into cloud cover. Priller's combat report was unusually detailed. He described the engagement as one of the most challenging of his career, comparing the unknown RAF pilot's skill to that of the best Soviet aces he had faced on the Eastern Front. When the report reached Reinhardt's desk, he noted one additional detail. The Spitfire had been marked with the codes of number 608 Squadron, and the engagement had occurred in an area where that squadron was known to be operating. Cross-referencing with his database of unusual encounters, Reinhardt found that number 608 Squadron appeared repeatedly, more than statistical chance would predict. He requested additional intelligence on number 608 Squadron and discovered something interesting. The squadron had a higher-than-average kill-to-loss ratio, and several of its pilots had been recommended for decorations. One name appeared multiple times: Flight Lieutenant J. Smythe. Reinhardt had no way of knowing Smythe's racial background from the available intelligence, but the pattern was suggestive. This pilot, whoever he was consistently achieving results that exceeded the RAF average. By August 1943, Reinhardt had compiled enough evidence to file a second report, this one more forcefully worded. He argued that regardless of the racial background of the pilots in question, the Luftwaffe was facing opponents with above-average skill levels, and that tactical doctrine needed to be adjusted accordingly. He recommended that German pilots be briefed to expect skilled opposition in any engagement, that the practice of assuming RAF pilots were inexperienced be discontinued, and that more resources be devoted to training German pilots in advanced defensive tactics. This time his report received a more serious hearing, though not for the reasons he had hoped. The Luftwaffe was facing a crisis in the summer of 1943. Losses over Germany, where American heavy bombers were conducting increasingly large daylight raids, were mounting. The RAF's night bombing campaign was devastating German cities, and on all fronts, the Luftwaffe was being forced onto the defensive, facing opponents who had numerical superiority and increasingly technological parity or superiority. In this context, Reinhardt's warnings about skilled RAF pilots were taken more seriously, but the racial dimension was still ignored or dismissed. Senior Luftwaffe commanders were willing to acknowledge that the RAF had improved its training and tactics, but they refused to accept that black pilots could be contributing to this improvement. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They could see the evidence of increased RAF effectiveness, but they couldn't accept the explanation that contradicted their ideological beliefs. The result was a dangerous blind spot in German tactical thinking. Luftwaffe pilots continued to be briefed that colonial troops, including pilots, were inferior and could be treated as less dangerous opponents. This assumption led to tactical mistakes. German pilots who encountered black RAF pilots sometimes underestimated them, approaching engagements with less caution than they would have shown against white opponents. The result was predictable. German pilots were shot down by opponents they had assumed would be easy targets. One such incident occurred in September 1943. A young German pilot, Lieutenant Hans Weber, was flying his first combat mission over France. His flight leader had briefed him that if he encountered a Spitfire, he should assess the pilot's skill level by observing their tactics. If they're aggressive and skilled, be cautious. If they seem hesitant or make mistakes, press the attack. Weber encountered a Spitfire and, observing that the pilot appeared to be flying cautiously, assumed he was facing an inexperienced opponent. He attacked aggressively, only to discover too late that the caution was actually tactical patience. The RAF pilot, Billy Strachan of No. 242 Squadron, had been baiting the trap. Weber's Bf-109 was shot down, and he spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, having learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of underestimating an opponent. By the autumn of 1943, the Abwehr's confusion about RAF capabilities had become a strategic liability. German intelligence was failing to accurately assess the threat, and Luftwaffe pilots were paying the price. But the institutional resistance to acknowledging the truth that black pilots were not only competent but exceptional remained insurmountable. The Nazi regime's racial ideology had created a blind spot that no amount of evidence could penetrate. Reinhardt, increasingly frustrated, continued to file reports documenting the unusual combat encounters and the pattern of above-average RAF performance. But his warnings were filed away, dismissed by superiors who couldn't reconcile the evidence with their beliefs. It was a failure of intelligence analysis driven by ideology, and it would contribute to the Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness as the war progressed. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the black pilots of the RAF continued to fly and fight, unaware that their success was causing confusion and consternation in German intelligence headquarters. They were focused on the immediate challenges of combat, on survival and on proving, mission by mission, engagement by engagement, that they belonged in the cockpits of Britain's fighters. The fact that their excellence was incomprehensible to their enemies was, in its own way, an additional weapon in the Allied arsenal. The late summer of 1943 brought a new phase of the air war over Europe. The Allies were preparing for the eventual invasion of the continent, and part of that preparation involved testing German defenses and gathering intelligence about their response capabilities. Operation Jubilee, the disastrous raid on Dieppe in August 1942, had taught painful lessons about the strength of German coastal defenses. Now, a year later, the RAF was conducting intensive operations to suppress German fighter strength and establish air superiority over the Channel. These operations placed enormous demands on fighter command. Squadrons were flying multiple missions per day, losses were mounting, and pilot fatigue was becoming a critical issue. No. 608 Squadron, now recognized as one of the most effective units in fighter command, was at the forefront of these operations. Flight Lieutenant Johnny Smythe had been promoted to acting squadron leader after the previous commander was shot down over France, making him one of the few black officers in the RAF to hold a command position, even temporarily. The promotion had been controversial. Several senior officers at Fighter Command headquarters had objected, arguing that placing a black officer in command of a squadron, even temporarily, would damage morale and set a dangerous precedent. But Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, who had authorized the original trial program, overruled the objections. His reasoning was pragmatic. Smythe was the most experienced and capable officer available, and the squadron needed effective leadership. "I don't care about precedent," Lee Mallory reportedly said. "I care about killing Germans and keeping our pilots alive. Smythe can do both." On September 8, 1943, No. 608 Squadron was tasked with escorting a formation of B-26 Marauder medium bombers attacking a German airfield near Beauvais, France. Intelligence indicated that the airfield housed elements of JG-26, including some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots. The mission was expected to draw a strong German response, and Fighter Command was sending multiple squadrons to ensure the bombers could complete their attack and return safely. The mission began routinely. The formation crossed the Channel at dawn, the bombers flying at 12,000 feet, with the Spitfires weaving above them at 15,000 feet. The weather was clear, a rarity for the Channel in September, which meant excellent visibility, but also that German radar would track them from the moment they crossed the coast. Smythe, leading the squadron, knew that the Luftwaffe would be scrambling fighters to intercept. The question was when and where the attack would come. The answer came as the formation approached the target. German fighters, a mixed formation of FW-190s and Bf-109s, at least 30 aircraft, dove out of the sun in a coordinated attack. It was a classic bounce, executed with the precision that characterized JG-26's operations. The German pilots were targeting the bombers, trying to break up the formation before they could drop their bombs. Smythe's response was immediate and decisive. Rather than maintaining the escort position above the bombers, he led the squadron in a climbing turn directly into the German attack, intercepting the enemy fighters before they could reach the bombers. It was an aggressive move that put his squadron at a tactical disadvantage. They were climbing while the Germans had the energy advantage of their dive. But it disrupted the German attack plan and bought time for the other escort squadrons to respond. The resulting dogfight was one of the largest and most intense of the Channel campaign. Over 50 fighters were engaged in a swirling melee that ranged from 18,000 feet down to the deck. Smythe found himself in the thick of it, engaging multiple opponents, calling out threats to his squadron mates and trying to maintain some semblance of tactical coordination in the chaos. At one point, Smythe saw a Fu-190 lining up on one of his pilots, Pilot Officer David Thompson, who was focused on his own target and unaware of the threat. Smythe broke off his own attack and dove to intercept, firing a long burst that forced the German pilot to break away. Thompson, realizing how close he had come to being shot down, gave a quick radio call. "Thanks, boss. I owe you a pint." But the situation was deteriorating. The German fighters were numerous and aggressive, and the RAF squadrons were being forced onto the defensive. Several Spitfires had been hit, and at least 2 were trailing smoke. The bombers, though still in formation, were taking damage from German fighters that had broken through the escort screen. If the situation didn't change quickly, the mission would fail, and losses would be catastrophic. Smythe made a split-second decision that would later be analyzed in tactical studies at RAF staff colleges. He ordered half his squadron to maintain the defensive screen around the bombers, while he led the other half in an aggressive counterattack against the German fighters. It was a calculated risk. Splitting his force could leave both groups vulnerable, but it was the only way to regain the initiative. Leading his section in a high-speed dive, Smythe targeted the German fighters that were pressing the attack on the bombers. His first burst hit a Bf-109 that was lining up on a Marauder, the German fighter exploding in a ball of fire. His second attack damaged a FW-190, forcing it to break off. The aggressive counterattack disrupted the German coordination, and other RAF squadrons, seeing Smythe's move, followed suit. The tide of the battle shifted. The German fighters, suddenly facing a coordinated counterattack instead of a defensive screen, began to disengage. Some were running low on fuel and ammunition. Others had taken damage. Within minutes, the sky began to clear as the Luftwaffe fighters broke off and headed back to their bases. The bombers, though damaged, completed their attack run and turned for home. The return flight was tense. Several aircraft were badly damaged and fuel was running low. Smythe's own Spitfire had taken hits in the wing and fuselage, and his engine was running rough, but he stayed with the formation, shepherding the damaged aircraft back across the channel. When they finally crossed the English coast and began landing at their bases, the relief was palpable. The post-mission debriefing revealed the scale of the success. No, 608 Squadron had shot down 7 German fighters confirmed, with another 4 probables, for the loss of 1 Spitfire. The pilot had bailed out over the channel and was rescued by air-sea rescue. The bombers had all returned, though several were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Most importantly, the mission had achieved its objective. The German airfield had been heavily damaged, and JG-26's operations would be disrupted for days. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory personally called Smythe to congratulate him on the squadron's performance. "That was exceptional leadership, Smythe. You made the right call at the right time, and you saved those bombers. Well done." The call was brief, but its significance was profound. A black officer was being publicly praised by a senior commander for tactical excellence in one of the most demanding combat situations imaginable. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. Among the German fighters shot down during the engagement was the aircraft of Hauptmann Josef Priller, the commander of JG-26. Priller had been forced to bail out over France after his Feli 190 was badly damaged, ironically by the same RAF pilot who had nearly shot him down in July. Priller survived and returned to his unit, but his combat report, which was later captured by Allied intelligence, provided a remarkable assessment of the engagement. Priller wrote, "The RAF squadron we engaged was led by a pilot of exceptional skill. His tactical decisions were sound, his execution was aggressive, and his squadron fought with a cohesion and effectiveness that I have rarely encountered. This was not the performance of a typical RAF unit. Either they have significantly improved their training, or we are facing a new caliber of opponent. I recommend that all units be briefed to expect this level of opposition in future engagements." When British intelligence analysts read Priller's report, they cross-referenced it with the mission details and realized that the pilot of exceptional skill was Johnny Smythe. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desk of Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff. Portal, reading the report, made a note in the margin. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need. Recommend immediate confirmation of Smythe's promotion to squadron leader and consideration for further advancement." The crisis at Dieppe had become a vindication. The black pilots of the RAF, and Johnny Smythe in particular, had proven beyond any doubt that they could not only fly and fight, but lead. The institutional resistance that had kept them from command positions was beginning to crumble, not because of policy changes or political pressure, but because of undeniable combat effectiveness. In the weeks following the mission, the story of No. 608 Squadron's performance spread through fighter command. Other squadrons requested briefings on Smythe's tactics. Training schools began incorporating his techniques into their curricula. And most significantly, the Air Ministry quietly authorized the expansion of the program that had begun as a limited trial. More black pilots would be recruited, trained, and assigned to operational squadrons. The door that had been barely cracked open in January 1943 was now swinging wide. But the vindication came at a cost. The intensity of operations was taking its toll. Smythe and the other black pilots were flying multiple missions per day, facing an enemy that was skilled and determined. The physical and mental strain was immense. Several pilots were showing signs of combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare, the trembling hands, the nightmares that made sleep impossible. The RAF's policy was to rotate pilots out of combat after a certain number of missions. But the demand for experienced pilots was so high that rotations were often delayed. Smythe himself was exhausted. He had been in continuous combat for 9 months, had flown over 150 missions, and had been shot at more times than he could count. He had seen friends die, had pulled the trigger and killed men he had never met, and had carried the burden of command in some of the most intense combat of the war. The weight of it was crushing, but he couldn't show it. He was still on trial, still representing everyone who looked like him, still proving that he belonged. In a letter to his family in Sierra Leone, written in late September 1943, Smythe captured the complexity of his situation. "I am proud of what we have accomplished, but I am also weary beyond words. We have proven that we can fly and fight as well as anyone, but the cost has been high. I have lost count of how many times I have cheated death, and I wonder how much longer my luck will hold. But I cannot stop. Not yet. There is still too much to prove, too many doors to open for those who will come after us. So I will keep flying, keep fighting, and pray that I live to see the day when no one questions whether we belong in the sky." That day was coming, but it would require one more crisis, one more moment when the black pilots of the RAF would demonstrate that their excellence was not luck or anomaly, but the result of skill, courage, and an unshakable determination to prove their worth. By the spring of 1944, the character of the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. The Allies had achieved air superiority over the Channel and much of occupied France. The Luftwaffe, battered by years of attrition and facing fuel shortages, was increasingly unable to contest Allied air operations. The stage was being set for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, and the RAF's fighter squadrons would play a critical role in ensuring the invasion's success. No. 608 Squadron, now permanently commanded by squadron leader Johnny Smythe, was assigned to the 2nd Tactical Air Force, the formation responsible for providing air support to the invasion forces. In the months leading up to D-Day, the squadron flew intensive operations against German transportation networks, airfields, and radar installations, all designed to isolate the invasion beaches and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones. Smythe's reputation had grown considerably. He was now recognized as one of the RAF's most effective squadron commanders, with a combat record that included 15 confirmed kills, numerous ground targets destroyed, and a distinguished flying cross with bar. More importantly, he had demonstrated an ability to lead men in combat, to make sound tactical decisions under pressure, and to bring his pilots home alive. His race, once the subject of skepticism and prejudice, was now rarely mentioned. His competence spoke louder than any doubts. But the success of the black pilots in the RAF had created a new challenge for the British High Command. The original trial program had been expanded, and by early 1944 there were over 50 black pilots serving in operational squadrons across Fighter Command and Bomber Command. Their collective combat record was exceptional, higher than average kill ratios, lower than average loss rates, and numerous decorations for valor. The question was no longer whether they could fly and fight, but what to do with this success. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, now the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, faced a decision that would have implications far beyond the immediate military situation. The success of the black pilots had demonstrated that the RAF's meritocratic ideals could extend across racial lines, but it had also exposed the contradictions in British imperial policy. How could Britain claim to be fighting for freedom and democracy while maintaining a colonial system that denied full equality to the very men who were defending the empire? The decision Leigh-Mallory made was both pragmatic and, in its own way, revolutionary. In a confidential memorandum to the Air Ministry in April 1944, he recommended that all restrictions on the recruitment and advancement of black pilots be formally removed. The performance of these officers and men has exceeded all expectations, he wrote. They have demonstrated that skill in combat is not determined by race, but by training, courage, and determination. To continue to limit their opportunities would be not only unjust, but militarily foolish. We need every capable pilot we can get, and these men have proven their capability beyond any doubt. The memorandum sparked intense debate within the Air Ministry and the War Cabinet. Some officials argued that removing restrictions would create political problems, particularly in the colonies, where racial hierarchies were fundamental to British rule. Others worried about public reaction in Britain, where racial attitudes, though less codified than in some other countries, were still marked by prejudice and paternalism. But the military argument was compelling. The RAF was still losing pilots at an unsustainable rate, and the demands of the coming invasion would only increase the need for experienced aircrew. Moreover, the success of the black pilots had created a powerful narrative that could be used for propaganda purposes, demonstrating the unity of the British Empire and Commonwealth in the fight against fascism. After weeks of debate, the War Cabinet approved Lee Mallory's recommendation, though with the caveat that the policy change would be implemented quietly, without public fanfare. The practical effect was immediate. Recruitment of black pilots from across the Empire and Commonwealth was accelerated. Training standards, which had been deliberately set higher for black candidates, were equalized. And most significantly, the informal barriers to advancement were removed. Black pilots could now, in theory, rise to any rank based on merit. The test of this new policy came with Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the RAF flew thousands of sorties to provide air cover, interdict German reinforcements, and support ground operations. Number 608 Squadron was in the thick of it, flying multiple missions per day from forward airfields in southern England. The intensity of operations on D-Day and the days following was unlike anything the pilots had experienced. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, mounted desperate attempts to attack the invasion fleet and the landing beaches. German fighters, flying from bases deep in France, conducted hit-and-run raids that required constant vigilance from the RAF's fighter squadrons. The risk of mid-air collisions was high, with hundreds of Allied aircraft operating in the same airspace, and the pressure to maintain air superiority was immense. Any failure could result in catastrophic losses for the troops on the ground. Smythe, a number 608 Squadron, flew 6 missions on D-Day alone, a grueling schedule that pushed pilots and aircraft to their limits. On their third mission of the day, while patrolling over the invasion beaches, they intercepted a formation of Bf-109s attempting to attack Allied ships offshore. The resulting engagement was brief but intense. Smythe personally shot down 2 German fighters, and the squadron claimed 5 more, breaking up the attack before it could reach the ships. But it was on June 8th, during the critical phase when German armored divisions were attempting to reach the invasion beaches, that Smythe and his squadron achieved their most significant success. Intelligence had identified a major German troop movement along a road network south of Caen. Number 608 Squadron was tasked with a ground attack mission, strafing and bombing the German column to delay their arrival at the front. Ground attack missions were among the most dangerous in the RAF's repertoire. Flying low and slow to attack ground targets made aircraft vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and the Luftwaffe often positioned fighters to ambush Allied aircraft during these vulnerable moments. Smythe briefed his pilots carefully, emphasizing the need for speed, surprise, and mutual support. The attack was executed perfectly. The squadron dove on the German column, their cannons and bombs wreaking havoc on trucks, tanks, and infantry. The Germans, caught in the open, suffered heavy casualties, but as the Spitfires pulled up from their attack runs, they were bounced by a swarm of FW-190s that had been lurking above, waiting for exactly this moment. The German attack was well coordinated, and several Spitfires were hit in the initial pass. Smythe, seeing his squadron in danger, made a decision that exemplified his leadership style. Rather than ordering a defensive withdrawal, he called for his pilots to turn into the attack, transforming the ambush into a dogfight where the Spitfire's superior turning ability could be brought to bear. The gamble worked. The German pilots, expecting the RAF fighters to flee, were caught off guard by the aggressive response. In the turning fight that followed, No. 608 Squadron shot down 3 FW-190s and damaged 2 more, for the loss of 1 Spitfire. The pilot successfully bailed out and was rescued by advancing Allied troops. The German column, meanwhile, had been so badly damaged that it would not reach the front for another 2 days, a delay that proved critical in allowing Allied forces to consolidate their beachhead. The success of the mission and Smythe's leadership during the engagement was noted in the operational reports that flowed up to Allied Expeditionary Air Force headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, personally reviewed the reports and sent a message of commendation to No. 608 Squadron. Your actions on June 8th directly contributed to the success of our ground operations. The delay you imposed on enemy reinforcements may have saved hundreds of Allied lives. Well done. For Smythe and the other black pilots in the RAF, the commendation from Eisenhower was a moment of profound validation. They had not only proven themselves in combat, but had made a tangible contribution to one of the most important military operations in history. The doubts, the skepticism, the prejudice, all of it had been answered not with words, but with actions. But the most significant impact was on the German side. Luftwaffe intelligence, analyzing the pattern of RAF operations during Overlord, finally began to understand what Major Klaus Reinhardt of the Abwehr had been trying to tell them for over a year. The RAF's fighter squadrons were not just numerous, they were exceptionally well-led and tactically sophisticated. The assumption that colonial pilots were inferior had been catastrophically wrong, and German pilots had paid the price for that assumption. In a post-operation analysis, General Major Adolf Galland, the General of Fighters, acknowledged the reality. The RAF has achieved a level of tactical excellence that we can no longer match. Their pilots are well-trained, aggressive, and led by commanders who understand modern air combat. We must abandon any assumptions about the inferiority of their colonial forces. The evidence suggests they are among the most effective units we face. It was a remarkable admission from a senior Luftwaffe officer, and it represented the collapse of the ideological blind spot that had plagued German intelligence for years. The black pilots of the RAF had not only proven themselves to their own commanders, but had forced their enemies to acknowledge their excellence. As the summer of 1944 progressed and Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the liberation of France, No. 608 Squadron continued to fly and fight. Smythe was promoted to wing commander and given command of an entire wing of fighter squadrons, a position that would have been unthinkable for a black officer just 2 years earlier. Other black pilots were similarly advancing, taking on leadership roles and mentoring the next generation of RAF pilots. The transformation was not complete. Racial prejudice did not disappear overnight, and black servicemen still faced discrimination both within the military and in civilian society. But the door had been opened, and it could not be closed. The black pilots of the RAF had proven, beyond any doubt, that excellence in combat had nothing to do with the color of a pilot's skin and everything to do with skill, courage, and determination. Their success had forced the British High Command to confront its own contradictions and to live up to its stated ideals of meritocracy and fair play. It was a victory won, not through policy changes or political pressure, but through undeniable performance in the most demanding test imaginable: combat against a skilled and determined enemy. And it was a victory that would resonate far beyond the immediate military context, contributing to the broader struggle for racial equality that would define the post-war world. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the pilots of the RAF, including the black airmen who had fought with such distinction, VE Day was a moment of profound relief mixed with exhaustion and grief. They had survived, but many of their comrades had not. The cost of victory had been measured in thousands of lives, and every pilot carried the memory of friends who had not returned from missions over France, Germany, and the Channel. Wing Commander Johnny Smythe stood on the tarmac at RAF Biggin Hill on VE Day, watching as his pilots celebrated the end of the war. He felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, sorrow for those who had been lost, and uncertainty about what the future would hold. The war had given him a purpose and a platform to prove himself, but what would peace bring? Would the doors that had been opened during the war remain open, or would Britain revert to the old hierarchies and prejudices? The statistics of the black pilots' contribution to the RAF's victory were remarkable. Over the course of the war, approximately 150 black pilots had served in operational squadrons, flying fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Collectively, they had achieved over 300 confirmed kills, destroyed countless ground targets, and flown thousands of combat missions. Their loss rate was actually lower than the RAF average, suggesting that their skill and caution had kept them alive in an environment where survival was never guaranteed. Individual achievements were equally impressive. Smythe himself had ended the war with 22 confirmed kills, making him one of the RAF's leading aces. He had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 bars, the Distinguished Service Order, and had been mentioned in dispatches multiple times. Other black pilots had similar records of distinction. Flight Lieutenant Ulrich Cross, flying Mosquito night fighters, had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Distinguished Service Order for his role in the night defense of Britain. Pilot Officer Billy Strachan had been credited with saving multiple damaged aircraft through his exceptional flying skills, earning him the Air Force Cross. But beyond the individual achievements, the black pilots had accomplished something more significant. They had forced the RAF and the British military establishment to confront and to some extent overcome its own racial prejudices. They had demonstrated that the meritocratic ideals the RAF claimed to uphold could and should extend across racial lines, and they had opened doors for future generations of black servicemen and women who would serve in the British Armed Forces. The immediate post-war period, however, brought new challenges. As the RAF demobilized and returned to peacetime strength, many pilots, including some of the black airmen, were released from service. The question of what they would do in civilian life was complicated by the racial attitudes that still prevailed in British society. Some returned to their home countries in the Caribbean, Africa, or elsewhere in the Commonwealth, where they often faced the same colonial structures they had hoped the war would change. Others remained in Britain, seeking to build lives in a country that had accepted them as warriors, but was less certain about accepting them as equals in peacetime. Smythe chose to remain in the RAF, one of the few black officers to do so. He was assigned to a staff position at the Air Ministry, where he worked on developing post-war fighter tactics and training programs. It was important work, but it lacked the intensity and purpose of combat. He found himself missing the clarity of wartime when the mission was clear and success was measured in tangible terms. Peacetime was more ambiguous, and the bureaucratic politics of the Air Ministry were frustrating after years of operational command. But Smythe also recognized that his presence in the RAF and his continued advancement was important symbolically. He was proof that black officers could succeed at the highest levels of the military, and his example would make it easier for others to follow. In 1947, he was promoted to Group Captain, making him one of the highest-ranking black officers in the British military. The promotion was noted in the press, and Smythe found himself, somewhat uncomfortably, becoming a public figure and a symbol of racial progress. The broader impact of the black pilots' wartime service became clearer as the years passed. Their success had contributed to a gradual shift in British military policy regarding race. The formal barriers to recruitment and advancement of black servicemen were removed, though informal prejudices persisted. The RAF in particular became known as one of the more progressive branches of the British military. a reputation that owed much to the example set by Smythe and his fellow pilots during the war. The legacy extended beyond the military. The story of the black pilots, though not widely publicized immediately after the war, became part of the broader narrative of the Caribbean and African contribution to Britain's victory. This narrative, in turn, contributed to the political movements for independence that swept through the British Empire in the decades following the war. The men who had fought for freedom in Europe returned home determined to achieve freedom for their own countries, and their wartime service gave them moral authority and practical experience that proved invaluable in the independence struggles. Smythe himself became involved in these movements, though always carefully, given his position in the RAF. He maintained correspondence with political leaders in Sierra Leone and other West African territories, offering advice and support as they navigated the path to independence. When Sierra Leone achieved independence in 1961, Smythe was invited to attend the celebrations as a guest of honor, recognition of his service both to Britain and to his home country. The technological and tactical legacy of the Black Pilot Service was also significant. The tactics that Smythe and others had developed during the war, aggressive interception, patient energy management, coordinated squadron attacks, became standard doctrine in the post-war RAF. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from their combat experience, and the emphasis on meritocracy and skill-based advancement, which had been validated by their success, became more firmly embedded in RAF culture. Perhaps most importantly, the black pilots had demonstrated the power of perseverance in the face of institutional prejudice. They had faced skepticism, discrimination, and barriers at every turn, yet they had succeeded through undeniable excellence. Their example inspired not just future generations of black servicemen, but anyone who faced discrimination or doubt. The message was clear: excellence cannot be denied, and determination can overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. In 1965, 20 years after the end of the war, the RAF held a reunion for the pilots who had served in fighter command during the Battle of Britain and the subsequent air campaigns. Smythe, now retired from the RAF with the rank of Air Commodore, attended the reunion. He found himself surrounded by men he had flown with, fought alongside, and in some cases saved from death. The camaraderie was genuine, the respect mutual. The racial tensions that had marked the early days of the war had faded, replaced by the bond that comes from shared danger and shared sacrifice. During the reunion, Smythe was asked to give a speech. He spoke briefly, as was his nature, but his words captured the essence of what the black pilots had accomplished. We came from across the Empire and Commonwealth, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from places that many in Britain had never heard of. We came because we believed in the cause, because we wanted to fight fascism and defend freedom. We were told we couldn't fly, that we weren't capable, that we didn't belong in the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes. But we proved them wrong. We proved that courage and skill have no color, that excellence can emerge from anywhere, and that when a nation is fighting for its survival, it cannot afford to waste the talents of any of its people. We opened doors that had been closed, not through politics or protest, but through performance. We flew, we fought, and we won. And in doing so, we changed not just the RAF, but Britain itself. That is our legacy, and it is one we can be proud of. The speech was met with sustained applause, and in that moment Smythe felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun in 1940, when he had first arrived in Britain as a young volunteer eager to fly, had come full circle. He had proven himself, had led men in combat, had risen to high rank, and had helped to change an institution that had initially doubted him. The cost had been high: years of stress, the loss of friends, the burden of representing an entire race. But the achievement was undeniable. Johnny Smythe passed away in 1996 at the age of 78. His obituary in the Times noted his distinguished RAF career, his combat record, and his role in breaking down racial barriers in the British military. But it also noted something more personal, that he had been a man of quiet dignity, exceptional courage, and unwavering determination. He had faced prejudice and overcome it, not through anger or confrontation, but through excellence that could not be denied. The legacy of Smythe and the other black pilots of the RAF endures. Their story is taught in RAF training schools as an example of leadership and perseverance. Their combat records are studied in tactical courses, and their example continues to inspire new generations of servicemen and women from diverse backgrounds who serve in the British Armed Forces. In 2014, the RAF unveiled a memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, honouring the Caribbean and African servicemen who served in the RAF during World War II. The memorial features a bronze statue of a pilot in flying gear, looking skyward, with an inscription that reads, "They came from across the empire to defend freedom. They flew with courage, fought with honour, and proved that excellence knows no boundaries. Their legacy is our inspiration." The memorial stands as a testament to what the black pilots of the RAF accomplished, not just in terms of combat victories, though those were significant, but in terms of changing hearts, minds, and institutions. They proved that the greatest weapon in any nation's arsenal is not technology or numbers, but the courage to recognize and utilize the talents of all its people, regardless of race or background. Their story is a reminder that progress often comes not from grand policy changes or political movements, but from individuals who refuse to accept limitations, who insist on proving themselves, and who demonstrate through their actions that the barriers society erects are artificial and can be overcome. The black pilots of the RAF flew into history, and in doing so they changed the future. If you found this remarkable story of courage, determination, and the triumph of merit over prejudice as compelling as we did, please do subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. These untold stories of the Second World War deserve to be remembered and shared. What other hidden chapters of British wartime history would you like us to explore? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you know someone who would appreciate learning about these extraordinary pilots who changed the RAF and helped win the war, please share this video with them. Together, we can ensure that the legacy of these heroes is never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.